Hi, I'm Rosenberg. Welcome to my latest YouTube video and podcast. Today I'm going to present an older video that I recorded 8 years ago. I recorded it when I was presenting in Illinois on a training called Healing the Inner Trauma Child, and it was highlighting my therapy technique called the HITCH method and other very important trauma-related issues connected to self-love deficit disorder, or as many of you know, codependency. I wanted to show how much the older information is still relevant by sharing this clip with you. And I wanted to invite a new discussion in on it. Just as much as in 2018 when this was recorded, as now in 2025, I understand and completely remain convinced how crucial it is for us, whether we're psychotherapists trying to help codependents or people with self-love deficit disorder to overcome this horrific problem, or we are suffering from it, for us to understand that there is no way to find relief, to find help, to find a cure to the sadness, loneliness, and core shame that is endemic with self-love deficit disorder unless we address the trauma. And as you know, and I believe most of you have been following me, that SLDD, self-love deficit disorder, is caused by trauma, attachment trauma that occurred during the childhood of a soon-to-be adult codependent or self-love deficient adult. It is the type of trauma that comes from surviving the family environment with one narcissistic parent who you had to find a way to mold yourself, to reshape yourself, to overcome the adversity, the consequences, the pain, the suffering of being on the bad side of the narcissist. So you shaped yourself, you've molded yourself, you became the family hero, you became the trophy child, you became the gift bestowed to your narcissistic parent. You had to do something to survive the horrendous impact of a pathological narcissist, the horrendous impact that a pathological narcissist has on the family of origin, namely the siblings and the romantic partner. So please enjoy this video. If you should want more information on this, consider purchasing the full length, which is 6 hours long. In the description, I will have more information about purchasing the audio or video version of Healing the Inner Trauma Child seminar. Also, consider subscribing to my Patreon program and get content and unique information that is not available to most people. I hope that you like this video as much as you did 8 years ago. And for those who are new, I hope that you like the video and it teaches you something important.
Attachment trauma hurts. It hurts so much. We have to remember that. You guys, therapists or not, it hurts so much that we can't feel it. And if we understand, we understand how our mind works, our defense mechanisms work, how repression and suppression work, we understand that core shame, self-loathing, fear of rejection, abandonment are very, very painful feelings to have inside. I'm unlovable for who I am. I am lovable for what I do for you and what I don't do for me. And every person who is an SLD, that's their internal dialogue, whether they articulate it that way or they just feel it that way. So whether or not you remember your attachment trauma, and most of our clients don't, that's the technique that I'm going to be going through at the very end of this training, we're walking around with remnants of it. Being a human doing versus a human being, being relationally and emotionally isolated, the pathological loneliness, the addiction, and the perpetual love affair with narcissists who make you feel like crap. It's very painful. And if you can get to that type of pain in your therapy, or if you can get to that type of pain in your own personal work, we are now getting to the problem. We are taking the Band-Aid off, and we're starting to look at what we know as codependency or SLDD. We have to understand what trauma is. the DSM, and I love the idea that we have a book, a manual of sorts, that sorts out what all the diagnoses are and gives very specific and concrete explanations of what a disorder is. As much as many of us dislike that, and it leaves some disorders out, it is important for us to be able to have objective criteria to know what a disorder is and what it doesn't. So trauma, unfortunately, is seen by most people as post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you have a trauma disorder, the diagnosis is just that. Well, many of us know either by our own experience or our treatment of it, trauma is a much more diverse concept. It's not what happened to you, but your experience of it. Trauma is also affected, buffered, or mitigated by all sorts of important factors. Psychological resilience, supportive family, early mental health intervention. The reason this is important, because you're going to work with a client, or you are that person, and they have a sibling group of 5. And 3 of your siblings are pathological narcissists. And you, for some reason, are the caretaking, altruistic, loving SLD. Everyone loves and you take care of. How did you become that and not the narcissist? I talk about that in detail in my other training and in my book, but what determines the pathway from SLD to narcissism is, 1, are you able to be the object of adoration, love, the gift to the parent, the invisible kid, the pleasing kid, and is that how you figured out to get self-love? I mean, that's how you figured out to get your parents' narcissistic love. Well, we already talked about that. But I want to say that not all children are the same. So if we look at PTSD and we look at 3 people who are in the Gulf War, and we'll go 2 people. It's a group of 3, a friend just gets blown up to pieces in front of you. And you both saw it and experienced. One of the person develops extremely serious PTSD and the other doesn't. Why not? They experience the same trauma. There are so many mitigating and buffering factors that explain why someone is more impacted by trauma versus the other. It's the same concept kind of when we look at a child, that some children are born with a stronger predisposition. Some children might have a grandmother, they might have an aunt, they might have something that somehow makes the trauma less. So if we're going to understand trauma and we're going to create a continuum of trauma, we have to understand that not only is all trauma, that trauma is known in gradations, but it also is developed differently based on many, many factors. And that could be a training by itself. Attachment trauma and PTSD are not the same, and I want to be clear, but they're very similar. Because I know what PTSD is, I treat it. But they're very similar, and I ask you guys to think of them as similar. So for me, in order to get a better understanding of trauma, I had to redesign my own thinking of what trauma is. So we understand all trauma is not diagnosable. It doesn't rise to the diagnosis of PTSD or C-PTSD. Is that it for who's a PTSD specialist? Where's Bill? Bill? Oh, what PTSD, C-PTSD? What's it called? Yeah. So they're not all of it rises to that level. Trauma is something that occurs to us that is upsetting. We can't process it despite our intentions, both our conscious intentions and our our mind's available resources. We can't process it, and it is organized and relegated into our limbic system through the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex. Our brain has a way of organizing it to make ourselves protect ourselves. It is like we have a protection vault or a circuit breaker. The more profound the trauma is, the deeper it's buried, and the more that our brain becomes activated in its own reflex to protect ourselves. This all happens below our conscious thought. So when we are traumatized, it is too much for us to handle. There's too much distress and anxiety. It is moved into our limbic system. It is tucked away, and that is the most simplest explanation that I can give you of repression and the defense mechanism. Trauma should be organized according to levels of severity, mild to most severe. What happened to me in England did not result in PTSD. But when our practice manager told me, someone emailed me the other day, and you're probably here, and they said, and they panicked, because there's, who here, by the way, I forgot to do this, who here is out of town, who flew here from out of town? Raise your hands. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I am so honored that you guys did that. Someone sent me an email and says, I need validation because I just called the hotel and they said your training's not there. And all of a sudden I freaked out. Well, that was my trauma from London, and I got anxious and I called and realized it was under the wrong name, and we fixed it. Trauma does not always mean PTSD. There is moderate to severe levels of trauma that our mind reacts to. And I want you to reconsider this, because how we deal with moderate trauma activates some of the same defense mechanisms, whether they're biological or psychological, than severe trauma. Considering there are levels of trauma and trauma treatment works, a continuum should represent trauma resolution. So here is and by the way, I love continuums. I got a continuum in my first book. Yeah, everything's in gray. The trauma continuum, and there's 6 stages of trauma. And it's not a research-based tool, it's more of a paradigm bender. So the first level of trauma is trauma while feeling safe. There's a complete internal process and release. You go to Disneyland and Cinderella is drunk and she doesn't hug you or kiss you. Well, that's traumatic for a 6-year-old girl and maybe an androgynous 5-year-old boy. What the heck? Why not? He's not old enough to know it's embarrassing. Well, then your mommy says, it's okay, we love you. That's not really Cinderella, that's just some other person. She cries, and it's all gone. And if we're lucky, the little girl will remember it. The person feels safe. There was external forces that protected the child, and there was the ability to process it and release it. But it's still trauma, right? So level 2 is trauma while feeling moderately safe. Defense mechanisms are needed, and they're processed and released. Okay, well, Cinderella, who's drunk, comes up and starts yelling at you and pushes your mom, who's tried to defend, who tried to say, you're a bad Cinderella and how dare you treat my daughter. And so there's kind of like this scuffle. And of course I would wonder about the mom's judgment, but it is what it is. Well, the kid is like, Cinderella didn't hug her, mommy's yelling, and there's all this, this kerfuffle of all this stuff going on, and you're embarrassed, and you're kind of ashamed, and you feel unhappy, but daddy's there and says, okay, daddy takes care of it. Mommy says she's sorry. The child actually believes mommy is sorry. The child's experience is validated, and it's just kind of a bad memory. Well, there are some defense mechanisms that are activated. I'm not here to go into the detail of all the defense mechanisms there are, but you're not comfortable and the child has to deal with it, but it's going to be a memory. It's going to be, oh yeah, I remember when I went to Disneyland, and you'll laugh maybe when you're older and talk about when mom argued with Cinderella. Oh my gosh, I just realized, those who know me know I have dyslexia. 3's missing. That is so me. Katie, true or false? True. See, I only gave her one answer because I didn't want her to embarrass me, but absolutely. So 3, there's no 6. It's not the invisible one. Trauma with virtually no feelings of safety, heavier defense mechanisms, especially suppression. So you're back at Disney World. Mom is drinking, or mom is a narcissist. Mom's a pathological narcissist. By the way, I'm just winging this. I just made this one up. So Cinderella doesn't hug or kiss the child. Mom's a pathological narcissist who is triggered by the selfishness and having a narcissistic injury and starts yelling and screaming at Cinderella. Dad tries to stop mom. Security is involved, and you guys are escorted out of Disney World. Well, that's pretty traumatic for a child because the child's not feeling safe in her environment. There's no feelings of safety. It doesn't feel like anyone's protecting her. And so the child's going to have to figure out a way to deal with this. She's going to be upset. She's going to be mad. She's going to be hurt. But that's the trauma where we have to figure out how to organize it and deal with it. And that's going to be a trauma memory. And that's where I was in England. So I was in number 3. And I'll remember that, and it still will trigger me. And I joke that I have flashbacks, but those who have PTSD or treat PTSD, that's probably not fair because it's not at the same level of flashbacks. Number 4 is PTSD. This is what we understand and what we know as post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't want to go over it. Most of you guys know it, but this is Cinderella mom thing. Now we take it. Mom is put in jail. The child is taken away and taken by DCFS and temporarily placed in a foster home because mom and dad are crazy. They just beat up Cinderella and were put in jail because of, they were disruptive. That is really horrible. There is no feelings of safety. There is no way that anyone tried to mitigate the trauma. The child was, or the person was all alone, and all they have is their defense mechanisms to try to figure out this horrible, horrible memory. It gets relegated to our unconscious and to our limbic system, sorted into our amygdala, and we try to never remember that incident. And that's what we know as PTSD. And then we have number 5, complex PTSD, which is it's multiple traumas with multiple psychological issues. It's an exponential experience of trauma, and there's no different. I don't even want to try to explain what happened. And the person goes to foster care and is sexually abused. So the point is, when we look at attachment trauma, it doesn't have to fit into what we know as PTSD to understand that it is very painful. The person did not feel safe. There was not a way to process it. There was not a way for our brain's natural mechanisms, and they are unconscious and they are hardwired to process trauma, to learn from it. When we can't process trauma and to learn from it, there is a survival mechanism that takes those memories and they relegate that into a safe area where we can't feel or remember it anymore. The problem is, it's a very rudimentary process, and it ends up hurting us later if we don't work it out. So, attachment trauma is very close to PTSD. It might not rise to the exact definition, but if we acknowledge that it is close to it, we can then use what we know about PTSD, because some of us know a lot about PTSD. Some of us know a lot about trauma. I'm just saying, open up your mind a little bit, think about it a little bit in gray, and if you understand attachment trauma and you understand PTSD, then you might know what to do better in the treatment of trauma. Uncovering repressed trauma is very difficult work. SLD is not the problem, but a symptom. It's a symptom pretending to be a problem itself. It manifests as an addiction. It's kept around by pathological loneliness, but it originates as an attachment trauma, and it's repressed, and it becomes invisible, and the person can't remember. They might be able to remember facts, but they can't remember the feelings and the trauma memories. And if you're going to work and solve SLDD, and you want to finally get someone to break this habit, this horrible life pattern, we have to understand that the work has to connect to the trauma, and we know trauma is often repressed, suppressed, or all sorts of other psychodynamic, psychoanalytical terminology. Then we know that we have to do a certain type of psychotherapy that's got to connect to that. The type of therapy I do is not the only show around. I will talk about it, but there's other types of therapy that addresses it, anything from EMDR to body. I mean, there's a whole list of different type of trauma-based therapy, but it has to connect to the trauma.